Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the session today titled Engaging Students with Democracy's Contested Meanings, the Pros, Cons, and Possibilities of a College Civics Requirement. I am Brian Pusser, Associate Professor of Higher Education in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. I'm going to begin today by introducing each panelist, who will give us a brief introduction to their work before we move to our questions and discussions. And it is a very wonderful panel that I'm very honored to serve with today. So let me begin with Sandra Kelly, the Vice Provost and Director of Global Carolina and Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the University of South Carolina. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's my honor to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. And our next panelist is Roosevelt Montas, Director and Faculty Member, Freedom and Citizenship Program and Interim Director of American Studies at Columbia University. Welcome, Roosevelt.
Thank you, Brian. Delighted to be here.
And our third panelist is Trygve Thornveit, Director of Strategic Partnership for Minnesota Humanities Center and the founding director of the Institute for Public Life and Work. Welcome, Trygve.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Great. So for our first question, I want to just offer a little bit of context. I'll put out a question and then ask each of you to respond in turn, and then we'll move to our next question and so forth. And I will be very mindful of time for us all. The Pew Research Center has found over the past decade a consistent unhappiness on the part of individuals in many countries who are dissatisfied with the way their democracy is working. In a December survey in 2021, Pew found that 85% of those surveyed in the United States felt the political system either needed to be completely reformed or needed major changes. In another Pew survey from late 2021, both Republicans and Democrats who were aged 18 to 29, so college age, were about 25 percentage points less likely to agree that their party represented their interests very well, or somewhat well, than did Republicans and Democrats who were over 65. So we know that states are increasingly requiring civics courses in higher education. So perhaps each of you could say a little bit about in what ways you feel the required civics courses that you're aware of or can envision can make a difference in the understanding of representative democracy and the political system among college-age students. And Trygve, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, I think there are many ways, actually, that can happen. I think one of the interesting and challenging aspects of the question we're dealing with today regarding a requirement is exactly what needs to be required and what can feasibly be required. I think there are a few things that I personally would like to see every undergraduate learner have a chance to develop. Those are skills in information literacy, including media literacy. Those are skills in what I would call collaborative, productive citizenship, the ability to work across differences, not just in order to understand one another better, but in order to actually get things done together, to build relationships that are genuine working relationships. Civic literacy, which would include familiarity with major historical and contemporary features of American politics, and also ability to connect your personal interests to public interests in a way that does not equate the two entirely, but allows you to empathize with the interests and worldviews of diverse individuals and groups. And I think actually there are ways to structure courses that can really help students develop these skills. In my program, which is called Third Way Civics, we do focus on exposing students to some sort of basic content in U.S. history and U.S. government. We make sure it's extraordinarily diverse, representing as many voices, both traditionally authoritative and historically absented as we can. But our main role really is to make sure that students are the ones collectively producing the knowledge in the class by exercising the muscles that are responsible for the skills I just described. So I think one way that colleges and universities could help address this issue is to really experiment with and refine pedagogical approaches that help students build their civic muscles.
Great. Thank you very much. Roosevelt, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that kind of a first order of the situation on the ground is that universities, higher education is kind of systematically failing to educate students civically because it is not an intentional goal in most of general education. So I think that the laxity or the weakness of civic education in universities is a species, a symptom, a subset of a general weakness in general education. That is that in most universities, general education does not have intentional, explicit, pedagogical, and content design, but is simply general education, a way of carving up existing course offerings so that people will take, X many courses in the social sciences and X many courses in natural sciences and X many courses in the humanities and perhaps some temporal distribution. So there is overall an absence of intentional general education, which would have to include intentional general education, some thought about the civic, political lives, the citizenship lives of our students. Now, there are exceptions, of course. The one that I am most closely familiar with is at my own institution, Columbia's core curriculum, which I directed for 10 years, which presents students with a sort of overview of the Western tradition in political, ethical, social, and artistic expression. Students grapple with primary texts that argue for and debate many of the fundamental ideas that organize our government, democracy, human rights, political power, representation, different forms of government, democracy. I am also quite closely associated with another program which I currently direct, the Freedom and Citizenship Program, and in which I teach, and that's a program for high school students. And it takes a similar approach of introducing students to foundational texts in which the underlying ideas that structure our political life and our institutions are debated, worked out, and in which students can grapple with those debates and those ideas. And what you see happens with students often is a kind of awakening to the debates that underlie the news that they see every day, the structure of their lives, kind of the shape of our society. And that kind of civic education, which is an education in civic agency, seems to me to be the most important contribution that universities can make in this space of civic education.
Wonderful, thank you. Sandra, let's turn to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to be succinct, but I kind of want to give a little bit of history at the University of South Carolina. We are a large public university, a flagship. I'm talking about University of South Carolina, Columbia. And I oversee the Gen Ed Core, and we have 3 learning outcomes related to global citizenship and multicultural understanding. That includes historical perspectives, social science perspectives, as well as language. That's required of all of our undergraduates. We also have something called graduation with leadership distinction. This is entirely voluntary. About 10% of our undergraduates complete this, and it's in community service or diversity and social advocacy, global learning, professional and civic engagement, and in research. And so students choose to do this. They're fairly intensive, but they're on the transcript. So for example, if you do graduation with leadership distinction in community service, you have to have documented 300 hours of service. You have to have taken certain courses related to that. You also have to do an e-portfolio. It's fairly intensive and not for all students, in the sense that some of our students definitely are holding full-time jobs while going to school. It would be very difficult for them to complete that type of thing. Despite this, I am one of the in a state where our state legislators really wanted to have a required civics course. There was a law in the book dating from 1924 requiring any student who received a degree from any public institution in the state had to spend 6 credits studying the Constitution. I could go on about that law. It was basically, it also required a loyalty oath. There was not a single public institution in the state of South Carolina that was compliant with that law. It came to the forefront, and we, myself, our legislative liaisons, our provost at the time, really worked hard with the politicians to, knowing that this was going to happen, to work and develop a law basically that we could implement, given 27,000 undergraduates, and that we could be happy about. I also worked a lot with our faculty who teach a lot about kind of founding documents, history, political science, African American studies. So that went very well, actually. And so we actually, in the sense that the law came out in a form that really was something that we could implement in our curriculum without really creating bottlenecks. And so it requires that students take a class that they read the Constitution in its entirety. They read 5 Federalist Papers. They also read the Emancipation Declaration, as well as other papers related to the African American freedom struggle and Declaration of Independence. And so the law is very prescriptive of what must be in the syllabus. But the nice thing is that our faculty then can take that and develop courses that they feel really challenge the thinking and the engagement of the students. So we have a series of courses right now that meet the REACH Act requirements. Everything from an African American Studies course called Freedom Papers, Narrative of Race and Nation, to higher level political science courses on the judicial process. Obviously some history, early American history, those kinds of things. So we have those in place, and it meets the requirement of the law. We are monitored very heavily. It's a relatively new law. We have to show our syllabi. We have to show that we're meeting the letter of the law. But I think what has happened is that we have a group of faculty instructors who are making those courses into what we can be proud of as a first-class civics requirement. So hopefully that kind of gets a little bit at the question. So our students get it get civics education in a variety of settings, but we are in a state where it is required.
Great. Maybe we could take a minute and follow up a little bit on that point, because I think that you're pointing to we were discussing the pros and cons of requirements. Certainly the pro, to speak to Roosevelt's point, is that it's intentional and it's a university's focus on that task. I've spent my entire career thinking about and responding to questions about the degrees of autonomy that universities should have relative to legislatures for implementing the will of the people, particularly in public universities through curricula. Either Roosevelt, Trigby, or we could also, Sandra, have you weigh in on this as well. What are the keys to finding that balance between the autonomy for professionals to implement a required curriculum and the political energy and concern that comes from the legislative side or the governor to see that such a requirement is implemented? Maybe first we could hear from Roosevelt and Trigby, and then you might want to add something to that.
Yeah, well, clearly one has to make a distinction here between the private institutions and public institutions. Just by, as a matter of status, public institutions are under the jurisdiction and oversight of the political process of elected officials, legislatures, governors, etc. And there are many different kinds of arrangements. There has been traditional deference to the faculty and the local governance of the institutions. And that, of course, we may be coming to the end of that era. At least, at the very least, that arrangement is under extraordinary pressure now, as higher education has become a hot cultural war issue. Not only in South Carolina, Sandra has explained, but in other states, there is growing movement and pressure on public officials to step in and sort of impose, demand certain forms of curricular changes. Private schools is a somewhat different situation, although it's not entirely. And one can imagine the public, especially the federal government, has a number of significant tools at their disposals by which they can compel certain forms of changes even in private institutions, although up to now we have not seen that exercise for curricular purposes directly. The authority over the curriculum, in my view, belongs with the faculty. And that is not to say that, in my view, faculties have been discharging that authority in a productive way, in a responsible way. It seems to me that faculty have largely withdrawn from the task of specifying for the students what things are most worth knowing, for presenting to the students a cohesive picture of a kind of hierarchy of knowledge and practices that is not obviously definitive, is not ultimate, is not final, but is defensible, is thought out. It expresses the values and understanding collectively of the faculty. We have been in higher education not doing a decent job of that. At Columbia, the core curriculum is required of every student. I did it as an undergraduate. It's a common set of courses, so all of the students are in effect taking the same course, reading the same books, facing some of the same questions. And it seems to me that that is perfectly appropriate for faculty to do the hard work of deliberation and discussion and clarifying for themselves what the ultimate ends of a general education should be, and embodying that in a set of requirements. Those requirements, in my view, should include things that are directly political, directly relevant to a kind of civic empowering. It seems to me that students in the United States ought to be familiar with American founding documents, that they ought to be familiar with the place of race and slavery in American history and American contemporary culture, etc. There are a number of things. Those are my views, and I'm happy to kind of defend them before a faculty body. But the commitment that we as a faculty ought to make to present to our students some cohesive vision of what general education should achieve, I think is central, and that is where civic education belongs.
Great. Trygve, would you like to add any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have several. Actually, I think probably the easiest way to answer your question and to build off Roosevelt's answer is to just describe the effort that I'm most closely involved with to help universities provide civic learning to students in a highly polarized environment, the same environment that in one way or another is driving a lot of these discussions and initiatives about requirements. And I think in many ways I agree with Roosevelt, but I think we have to be careful in that polarized environment, and also in our efforts to build civic agency, we as faculty members or intellectuals or curricular architects need to be careful that in making our own informed choices about what we think students should learn, we are not playing the roles of the same types of people we are worried about dictating to us. So if I could just quickly explain the way we've tried to thread some of those needles through our initiative called Third Way Civics. Third Way Civics is an effort to infuse civic inquiry, civic identity formation, and capacity building into the essential function of higher education, in my view, which is undergraduate teaching and learning. It's housed at the Minnesota Humanities Center with support from the Teagle Foundation, but it's in several institutions across the country. We call it Third Way Civics, or 3WC, because it's designed to transcend the highly polarized history and civics wars that are engulfing the academy and the media and a growing number of local communities. These debates pit those who see the American experiment as essentially triumphant against those who see it as irredeemably tragic. That sets those who conceive civics as a body of knowledge about how American politics works against those who conceive it as training students to change how American politics works. Third way civics doesn't offer an alternative ideology, but employs what we hope is a nonpartisan and depolarizing pedagogy that's developed to transcend the binaries of the history and civics wars while building student capacity to think and learn and work with others across deep differences, which for me, even more than, or along with, but even more than familiarity with the great resources of the American political tradition and its tragedies, that capacity to think, learn, and work with others across differences, even deep differences, is what higher education needs to provide to all learners. With third way civics, we essentially do it in the form of a course, or rather a set of guidelines and models for constructing a course that can be adopted or adapted by any faculty member who's interested in trying the experiment. Most of them have taken the form of a US history course or a course in American political development. And to give you a sense for the kind of intellectual commitments I'm bringing to this conversation and to help answer exactly how to thread these needles, I'll just explain its three main elements. The first is what we call a contested and contestable canon. So these are readings consisting entirely of primary sources that are chosen to reflect the diversity of actors, goals, and perspectives that have shaped American history and culture. That's the contested canon part. In delivering the courses, instructors are treated as the professionals they are and encouraged to work with their colleagues, with community scholars, and with their students to revise the standard reading list or the model reading list to ensure diversity and relevance in their context. That's the contestable canon part. The second major element of 3WC is a pedagogy anchored in what we sometimes call first and second order discussions. So first order discussions divide students into separate groups, each assigned different reading clusters. They talk about those clusters together. They realize that, wow, you can read the same thing and come to very different conclusions. Then they're mixed up into second order discussions, placing them in mixed cluster groups in which they answer the same unit prompts, but with reference but while inviting answers, queries, and challenges from peers who read entirely different texts. And this is to reinforce students' sense of agency in the interpretation of evidence about the past and the present, while simultaneously highlighting the inadequacy of their own or any single interpretive lens. Again, our effort to try to get at this problem of polarization. And then finally, there are several additional cooperative classroom activities and extramural projects that are basically designed to help students connect what they have learned through their individual and collective inquiry to what they ought to do in their individual and collective capacities. And we think that's incredibly important too. I personally believe that everyone reading the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and seminal documents from other major periods of American history, I'm a trained historian, I think that's incredibly important. But for me, I think finding a pedagogical approach that puts students at the center of making meaning about any complex social and political topic and removes faculty from the position of saying, this is what is most important for you to know and what you ought to think about it, is an important way to avoid a lot of controversy. I think it's a productive way to develop the skills that students need. And I think it's also an important model to set for legislators and others who would deign to come in and tell faculty what they should be teaching students.
Great. Thank you, Trygve. Sandra, would you gave a nice articulation of what's happening in South Carolina. Is there anything you would add?
I think just maybe perhaps distinguishing between how you teach something versus what you teach. And, I would encourage anyone who's in a state where and they're in a public institution, to actually work with their state legislators to make sure that they don't tread into how you teach something. So if they're going to dictate that you have a civics education or a founding documents course, that's fine, but making sure that they know what the dividing line is, because that then taps into the creativity, the faculty engaging in discussion and with the students and letting the students drive the course. I think it's really, I think we were pretty successful in that, given, you know, it would be really nice if we were not being dictated by the state legislature what kind of courses we have to have. But then you have to realize that's the environment you're in, and working with the state legislators to make something that's compatible with our own academic ideals and the way we want to teach our students is, I think, really important.
Great. Thank you. Well, I would like to have a segue a little bit, following up on this question of the kind of political aspects of this. And as we think about these civics courses, we think about challenges to diversity and equity. We think about the legislative issues that are taking place in many states. It seems to me that many scholars and students feel that post-secondary curricula do not sufficiently include them. Their histories and their cultures. I think you've spoken to this a little bit, but I think this is very much has been an issue for several decades in discussions about civics education and going all the way back to the closing of the American mind and so forth. And at the same time, other scholars and students feel tasked with explaining the centrality in the curriculum of their histories and cultures. So what would you recommend for developing a civics education course that can help us better understand this current contest over the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education generally and in our curricula? And maybe, Roosevelt, we can start with you again.
Thank you. Very important issues indeed. So sometimes I think that there's three ways that you can approach civics education, and we see those three ways exemplified in various programs, both in the K through 12 and in the post-secondary landscape. One is to think about civic education as kind of information about the procedural structure of our democracy, so sort of the facts of our democratic processes. How does a bill become law? How are representatives elected? How many branches of government? What's the balance of power? What's the authority of the Supreme Court? Who does what in Congress and who does what in the executive, et cetera. And that's obviously important, but also especially with K through 12 and undergraduate, it can really miss the point of democratic and civic life, and it can easily become just another sort of collection of facts that students can absorb and regurgitate. And it is a kind of civic education. Then there is an approach that is sort of ideologically tinged, one that thinks of civic education as exposing students to a sort of patriotic narrative, steering them to love their country, to serve their nation, kind of a national pride, and that you can see a lot of echoes of that approach to civic education in some of the demands that state legislatures are making, and that is being used as a kind of counter to a perception that in college people learn to hate America, that people are being taught that America is kind of the source of evil, and that we need a counter narrative so that students can learn to admire and champion American values. And that's a very kind of ideological way of looking at civic education. There's a third way, which is my sort of the one I champion, which I call civic engaged civic education, engaged citizenship. And that has to do with equipping students with the tools of political agency, which are discursive tools. They're tools of deliberation, they're rhetorical tools, They involve knowledge of history and understanding of the evolution of our institutions. They involve values, but they involve values in a very kind of abstract commitment to values of liberty, democracy, representation. And I think when you think of civic education in this way, as training in civic engagement, training in engaged citizenship, then the diversity of voices, the diversity of issues, the sort of competing narratives that play out in our political culture have to be central to that kind of teaching. But in that centrality, I think one has to make a distinction. And that is, you can roughly think about it this way. There is a tradition of political development and political evolution on the basis of which our politics works, right? The evolution of ideas of rights, of democracy, of individuality, the debates between the authority of the collective versus the individual. Where do you draw the balance between citizenship and freedom? Questions about distribution of wealth and progressive taxation, kind of fundamental political ideas that every political system has to tackle and deal with and find a balance in. I think that civic education involves the learning about that tradition and that development. That development and tradition is not particularly concerned with the sort of American specific development of those ideas. So there's a kind of background that gets you then to the American case. And then I think when we start thinking about the American civic landscape, then we absolutely have to think about diversity. We absolutely have to think about representation. We absolutely have to think about the actual political landscape in which we live. So I think any attempt to suppress or to marginalize or to exclude the concerns of the marginalized, the exploited, the enslaved in our politics is preposterous. You're not going to get a view or an understanding or an appreciation of even the most basic American ideas unless you do that, unless you grapple with those issues and you get those voices in, because ultimately American citizenship, the civics of American, ultimately are about the politics of diversity. They are about the politics of coming together as one from a diversity of backgrounds, of opinions, and of interests.
Great. Thank you, Roosevelt. That's very, very thought-provoking. Appreciate those comments. Sandra, would you like to follow up on that?
I'll follow up a little bit, but I don't think I could be nearly as eloquent as Roosevelt. Thank you for that answer. So, you know, incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion, first of all, really, to me, from just an education point of view, it should be across the curriculum, not only in general education, but it should be in the major courses. It needs to be discussed in a way, it's not like, oh, now we're having the lecture on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It should be embedded for people to, our students to really understand how it does permeate all of our society and a lot of what we do. Putting it into a civics course in particular, I think is important. In some ways, the most powerful way to incorporate those issues is through experiential learning and really having the students go out into the community and understand the differences in privilege and access that you see across the community. I know for our students, that is a real powerful way for them to start thinking about it. Then you can present some of the history and where it comes from. But I think the learning is made more powerful through experiences really outside of the classroom.
Wonderful, thank you. Trygve? I think you're muted, sir.
Sorry, I have a few thoughts that I was processing, so it's good I was.
I want to hear every word, Trygve.
Right. I mean, I think diversity of ideas, experiences, anything that we can expose our students to in terms of that's an enormous goal for all learning. I think, and especially for learning how to be a citizen in a pluralistic society, as Roosevelt was saying. What I would say is that is two things for people who are really worried about how to include diversity and sort of, let's say, a grounding in the basics. First of all, when you start with primary sources and when you let students just wrestle with even our sort of traditional canon of texts in let's say that was the consensus back in, let's say, 1952 or something. There's a lot of diversity even just within those texts themselves. And students don't recognize that as much if they learn about them in a lecture or from a textbook as they do if they're just reading the sources. Secondly, you learn so much more about even those traditional texts if you're also allowed to get into the heads of and hear the voices of people whose perspectives were not represented in them. You learn a lot more about the hidden motivations or the other societal and cultural aspects at play if you read Benjamin Banneker writing to Thomas Jefferson than if you just read Thomas Jefferson worrying about the discrepancies between his ideals and the way they play out for African Americans, let's say. Thirdly, a diversity of sources is a way to combat this kind of false binary between a triumphalist or a tragic American past. You realize that there is just an enormously rich diversity of democratic resources in our past. And the way to have access to that full richness is to include the critics and those who lost certain major battles in our culture and society and economy. Because a lot of them had ideas and demonstrated resilience and had strategies that are incredibly informative, I think, for today. Finally, however, I think we need to be careful to make sure our students understand that there's never full diversity. And to make sure that we as instructors are not giving them the impression that here's a nice diverse array of voices and so you've got the full picture. I think we need to demonstrate the kind of intellectual humility that tells students, look, this is our best effort at getting you to understand that our whole tradition has been contested and will continue to be contested, but there is so much more out there, and it is up to you to tell us, what do you think is missing here? And up to you in all of your pursuits for the rest of your life to understand the value of diversity, not just in learning about other people, but in developing a way to empathize with others that makes your work across differences much more productive. So I'm more apt to invert Sandra's formula and say that in some way, thinking about diversity in the classroom and really practicing it among your students themselves as a mini community can be very good preparation for experiential learning outside the classroom. I wouldn't go to bat and say one has to come before the other at all. I think they can be mutually reinforcing.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to shift direction a little bit with the time we have left, and point out that we've talked a little bit about the philosophy and history, which are enormously important to thinking about civics and civics education. But it's also the case that we're in an environment in which the very nature of facts and evidence is contested. And I think that contest is central to thinking about civic engagement, democratic participation, and the degree of faith in which college-age students and others have in the democracy and in our democratic processes. So in thinking about a curriculum for civic engagement and democratic participation, how would you address the rise of social media and beyond social media, the sort of overwhelming amount of imperfect, let's say, and at times harmful information, which is available at the same time that we want to balance free expression and some of the other rights and principles that are also central to civics education. So Sandra, maybe we could start with you this time.
Sure. This one is an interesting problem, and it's changing so fast. I feel that we as academics have in some ways been caught off guard about how quickly social media has risen to the forefront, how our students are coming in fully phone literate, in the sense that they use their phone for news and things like that. I think it's extremely important to not talk about censorship, but talking about kind of the idea, first of all, really actually explaining to students the algorithms that social media uses to feed them information, whether that be through, TikTok or Instagram or whatever they're using, that they have to be very intentional about making sure that they actually expose themselves to multiple viewpoints, because then they can use their critical thinking skills to really evaluate kind of what is true. So information literacy, digital literacy is definitely kind of moving to the forefront, and it's urgent that we really talk about it in classrooms. And we don't talk about it by saying, put your phones away. I don't want you to do that anymore. I mean, you might not want them to do that in your class, but they're not going to put their phones away when they walk out of the classroom. So we have to educate them on how to use that social media and how to be a educated consumer of information, and then weeding through what might be not factual. I know in some of my own classes, I actually I make the students go out and find some fake news about particular issues that we're talking about, to really realize what you can find, and that you can find almost anything to support any viewpoint if you look hard enough. So I think we have to be more intentional about that, and recognizing that social media is here to stay. It's not going away. And these students, the next generation, are growing up fully immersed in it in a way that certainly I wasn't. Thanks. Oh, you're muted, Brian.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you for those very thoughtful comments. Roosevelt, would you like to share some thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I know we're running out of time. There's a lot to be said about this topic. The issue doesn't only concern the classroom. There is something that social media and the new information environment under which we function has done to public discourse, to civic discourse, to our capacity to metabolize information, to the channels by which information and misinformation is spread. We, I think, as a society, have been hit with a storm of changes in communication technology, and we have not had the discursive sophistication to really metabolize them. We are reeling from it, including in the academy. I have a lot of thoughts on this question. The one thing I would just narrow into in the interest of time, and this harkens to something that Trygve said, is that civic education really cannot happen by lecturing at students. We have to create an environment, in addition to what we deliver as content, we have to create a forum in which the virtues and requirements of civic discourse and democratic deliberation are exemplified. We need to be in small groups where we can talk to each other, or we can be part of a conversation, where we can exemplify, enact, model the democratic virtues that we are hoping to instill in our students. That means putting away the phones. That means having, at least in the classroom, a space in which we can function in a different sort of wavelength. And that is one basic contribution that I think we need to make, and that really, I think civic education cannot happen except in these kinds of small, intimate, discussion-intensive situations.
I would like to give a shout out to my class at Minnesota State University Mankato right now, who is, I think, watching this webinar, because I think one of the best ways we can help students develop media literacy is to do what we ask them to do every day, which is just to wrestle with texts, even in an environment where they expect typically an authoritative interpretation. I think we have to be very careful, as Roosevelt was saying, not to tell students what to think, or even to provide too determinative an interpretive framework before they get a chance to just wrestle with texts, with their own opinions, their own assumptions, and with one another to try to make meaning. If we can get them to understand that not just in the messy social media environment, but in all domains of human knowledge, there is no perfect information and there is no universally valid interpretation, that we make meaning, and that we're likelier to make good meaning if we are critical of our own assumptions and open to reasonable arguments from others and try to cast as wide a net as possible. I think that's the best that at least I, as a historian, think I could do to help develop media literacy skills. And I think it's critical for civic learning.
So maybe we could take a minute and move a little bit beyond media and social media. I think it's fair to say that many, if not most, national contexts and organizations have a kind of standard story about their history, their values, and what they stand for. And it seems to me that, while it's one thing to talk to students about, being able to tell the difference between an evidence-based truth and something which can be shown to be factually incorrect. And another thing to raise a discussion as part of civics education about the kind of standard and normative stories with which they have grown up, been instantiated, and need to grapple with, I think is a term you used, Trigby, in the same way they grapple with texts, that they need to grapple with as they approach democracy and civic engagement. So we do have about 10 minutes left, and I want to leave a little time for each of you to sort of give a concluding thought. But would any of you like to speak to that notion of revisiting our standard stories? I can call on you.
Well, I mean, as a trained historian, I think we have to constantly be revisiting our standard stories. And I think, again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, and I don't mean to say that faculty at universities should not share with students their informed interpretations of the past and present. But we have to realize that we also are people who have grown up with, who have been socialized in a certain way. And a lot of us have invested enormous intellectual and other resources into developing certain interpretations of the past and present to which we are deeply committed, not just professionally or on paper through research articles or whatever it might be, but emotionally. And so I think we have to be very, very careful to model openness to revising stories whenever we can, and to say, look, what I try to do is say, look, this is not a course that tells you what to think about American history and politics. This is a course that says, here are what a lot of people think are really important debates and events in American history. And here's what a lot of other people are starting to realize were left out of other stories. What does that make you think about the past? And what does it make you think about how you should engage in your own meaning making and the actions that you take based on the own stories that you tell about yourself and your society going forward? I think that is what I aspire to try to do with my classes.
Okay, go ahead, Roosevelt. Did you want to add something?
I was going to say, and I don't mean to just keep harping on the themes that kind of repeating each other, but that having students have direct encounters with the primary sources upon which the narratives are built is critical. That there is something so salutary and a kind of inoculative against ideology about seeing the primary sources themselves, about reading Jefferson not only write the Declaration of Independence, but talk about race. and talk about his concerns about slavery, and engage in exchanges like Trigby mentioned in letter writing with Black people who are defending the blacks of the rights of blacks and status of blacks in America and others. So frankly, I worry less when we have access and discussion of the primary text. I worry much less about ideological indoctrination when that's what we're doing, than when we sort of think that we already know what it is that the story is told and just try to tell the story to the student.
Great. Okay, we have a couple minutes left, and I know that each of you has committed a large portion of your intellectual and professional lives to thinking about democracy, about civic engagement and engaging with civics. If you had about a minute each or 2 minutes each, we're in a very slow elevator. What would you tell someone is kind of your hope for the future for civic engagement and particularly college civic learning? And maybe we could start with you, Trigby.
Wow. How slow is this elevator?
It's slow, but it's moving. It's
are we still waiting for other people to come in? Do I have time to collect myself?
Maybe a little of that, but
I would say I want my students to understand that citizenship is not just about their individual juridical relationship to a state or a set of institutions, that many people in our past, including both traditional dead white males and many, many others, such as those in the freedom movement of the mid-20th century, thought of citizenship in much broader ways as a way of being in whatever communities you depend upon and depend upon you. I would like them to think of politics as more than just what happens in formal political institutions, but as the way that we are good citizens, as what we do when we are pursuing our own self-interests with the knowledge that our lives ultimately are shaped by these other people. Our social worlds are shaped, our physical worlds are shaped, and we're going to be happier if we take some account of those people as just, and their values as facts of our situation. And I would like students to understand that they can, not just they can be, that they are right now citizens. They're not citizens in training. There's not some time where you become civically capacious. You are at any given moment acting like a citizen, like a member of a community whose actions are somewhat dictated by and definitely influence the actions and the thinking and the lives of others. So look for opportunities wherever you are to expand your thinking, to catalyze the talents and the capacities of the other people around you. That can be in your workplace, that can be in your classroom. And that doesn't mean that you're, quote, politicizing everything. It means that you understand that a democracy depends on an entire culture that supports certain habits of interaction with one another that are hopefully in the long run aimed at helping all of us thrive.
Thank you. Very nicely said. Sandra, how about you?
I think, my hope as we educate our students, and really my hope is that when they leave here with a degree in hand, that they have developed the habits of a citizen and that they will continue developing them. There's no way that they're going to finish their undergraduate and have a full understanding of the complexity of what American society is like, but that they understand that it is complex and they will continue to learn about it, continue to engage with it. And also understand that, that while democracy is seldom, is just not perfect, that doesn't mean you just throw everything out, that you actually can be the change agent within your local community, larger community, depending on kind of what you do and what your goals are, but really kind of getting students to really realize that what they might be learning in a civics class or in their general education curriculum or in their major is just the beginning, just the very, very beginning of what they'll need to learn across their entire lifespan.
Nice. Thank you. Roosevelt, I'll give you the last word on your hopes for the future.
We as educators keep front and center the fact that we're educating for citizenship. I am a 19th century American intellectual historian, and sometimes I'm teaching students about that. But when I'm teaching in general education, I am training students for citizenship. That we be intentional, we be conscious of the fact that we're not just preparing, we're just not training in careers, we're training in citizenship. What does that mean? What does that entail? And we're training for a particular kind of citizenship, global democratic citizenship. Democratic citizenship with respect to our own political community in America, but increasingly America is a higher education system for the world. So we are teaching a kind of democratic global citizenship. Let's remember that. Let's do it intentionally. Let's do it with clarity and with dedication.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you all. I'm also grateful that that this forum, this session, that we have so many people working who have thought deeply intellectually, who have committed themselves to practice for a very long time, are coming together from different standpoints and perspectives to make sense. I think it bodes very well for the future. I'm glad there are roles for many, many people in this process, and I think that these forums have been organized in a way that have brought people together from the academy, from associations, from practice in ways that I think are very, very helpful. And I look forward to that continuing. Those of you who are on this and would like to continue with the forum should know that we're now going to have about a 15-minute break. And after that, the next band of concurrent sessions will explore specific dimensions of civic and democratic learning, and especially how educators can foster these capacities from first to final year. We'll continue these discussions about higher education's distinctive role in civic and democratic learning again tomorrow, beginning with our next plenary session at 2 p.m. Friday 7th, Friday this February. Let me do this correctly. That would be Tuesday, February 7th, Eastern Standard Time. Most of all, I want to thank this panel for working so well together, and thank you, and I hope we can meet in person before too long. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.